Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Right to Read initiative. My name is Dr. Kathryn Garforth from Garforth Education, and I'm excited because today we are speaking with another excellent teacher about her teaching journey to the science of reading and structured literacy. I am sorry if my voice comes and goes today. I have just tested positive for COVID, but we're gonna push through anyways. So a big welcome to Kathryn Hayes-Waldhuber, and I look forward to learning about your journey. Good day, Kathryn. How are you?
I'm great, and I'm so happy to be here, and thanks for persevering and continuing on to make this platform available to everyone, even when you are so unwell. So thank you for doing that.
No problem. Well, let's start at the beginning of your teacher journey. What made you want to be a teacher?
So I'm a mother of three girls, and previous to getting to experience motherhood, I also came from a family of three girls, and in education, learning didn't always come easy to me. There were many times when I was faced with a lot of difficulties and didn't really understand why it was so challenging for me to learn and kind of persevere through an education system that didn't always meet my needs. So ultimately, that drove me to become an educator, not knowing why it was so difficult and why I struggled so much through traditional learning classroom environments. And when I reached grade 9, I was put forward to have a psych evaluation done. However, it was recommended that IPRC take place, but that was not pursued on my behalf, which is okay because it's all part of this learning journey and it's part of my story. And was at least identified that I did have some tendencies for dyslexia, and but without the formal identification, accommodations and modifications were not always put in place. So moving forward and pursuing my college certification and going through university, it made it a little bit more challenging because I didn't have the accommodations and modifications to advocate for myself. But that's okay because it gave me a new lens of how to support students through a universal design approach, right? Because I was so embedded in that state of challenge because it didn't come at ease to me. So kind of reflecting on all of that. And then about 4 years ago, I was provided the paperwork of my psych evaluation. And then all that kind of came to light. And I was like, wow, this is incredibly insightful now that I have all of this knowledge. And so that's one component to why I've become an advocate for structured literacy, because I see how it can help the kids turn their lights on. And a second component would be that my daughter was formally diagnosed as having dyslexia. We pursued in her grade 2 year private assessments to be completed for a formal diagnosis, which has been also another great learning journey because we've established those accommodations and modifications that she needs in order to be successful so early in her school career. So her learning journey kind of looked like kindergarten, really struggling. And we noticed that she wasn't consolidating those letter sounds, and she advocating for a structured literacy approach for her. And then when COVID happened, and the lockdowns occurred, we ultimately pulled her from public education, and for her full grade 3 year, she did a hybrid model of learning. So 2 days at private school. I program planned for her the other 2 days, and we were so fortunate to have a family member implement all of that. And then once a week, getting Orton Gillingham structured lessons through a speech pathologist. And to celebrate her successes, because she's reading at grade level now, and has come so far because of everything that's been put in place. And as she returned to public education, because I wholeheartedly believe that public education can serve our children. So putting her back into her school community, she has thrived, and the school's really been great at putting her into the right programs and advocating for her as well. She has been put in Empower as well to kind of continue to make those gains, because we know that core instruction is really critical to maintain those gains, because once we stop teaching those concepts, they start to lose them if they haven't been conceptualized or are not as concrete as we like. So she's on a great trajectory for learning. So we still just are going to continue to advocate for those next steps as she moves along her elementary career, for morphology and all of those next pieces that we know are beneficial and are research based, so that she can have those successes.
Of course. And every child deserves the right to read, right?
Absolutely.
And ideally not having to go through what you or I went through as students with learning disabilities. And you and I both have children with dyslexia, with that genetic nature. And it's hard to see them struggle, relating that to our own struggle. So we understand the why, but so once you finished high school, what did you do?
Struggled moving through, struggled. But I had an amazing support system, because my family knew that I needed that support. So they sought a tutor. And even though I wasn't formally identified through the board, they were putting those pieces in place for me to be as successful as possible. So I did have a tutor going through the rest of high school. And then I moved into a college program and focused on a Bachelor of Recreation and Leisure, and then shifted into Teachers College at Medaille University and in Buffalo. So when I went to Medaille, it was a great learning experience. I was introduced, I wouldn't say that I was provided with all the tools to be a successful reading instructor, because a reading teacher, because it is so complex, and you can't learn that depth of knowledge, especially when you already don't have it.
Yeah.
So I didn't learn it to the extent that I needed, but I was given a good foundation. So a platform for me to build off of. And what I mean by that is I was introduced to the Florida Center for Reading Research through Teachers College. And when I was hired at the board to do my first teaching position was a grade 1 LTO in the inner city. I based my entire program around the Florida Center for Reading Research to complement the curriculum, because that's how I understood reading should be approached. So, and it was the big 5, so the pillars. So each of my literacy centers within that grade 1 program focused on one of those big 5 pillars. So the kids had those foundational pieces. And that was just kind of a breaking point of my learning, almost like that iceberg. And once you get to that little bit of knowledge, there's just the depth of knowledge that you need in order to support the reading development along such a large continuum is a vast amount. of knowledge that you need. So from there, I completed my AQ courses in Ontario to get my reading specialist. And I was very fortunate enough. I took mine through Quaco, my part one. The instructor did focus a lot on the process of reading and phonological awareness and phonemic awareness. So I felt like I had a little bit more to build upon. And then the subsequent reading AQs focus more on comprehension and balanced literacy. So losing some of those pieces and really trying to find how it all weaves together. So I moved from teaching grade 1 into kindergarten for a few years. And then section 23, which is some classrooms within Ontario who the students I had were in foster care. So it was a smaller group of students with a focus on mandated to only teach literacy and mathematics. So I was able to narrow down more, but through K to 5. So my students in that class were from K to 5, and it was an amazing experience, one of the most rewarding, because relationships were so fundamental. But a lot of them needed that reading support because they missed all those basic early literacy skills because of the self-regulation and all of those other components, and their well-being wasn't being met. So kind of going back and kind of catching them up on some of those early literacy components was really important in that class. And then I moved into an instructional coach position.
Okay, let me just pause there for a minute because there are a couple questions I do have about.
Absolutely.
So you did a bachelor's in leisure and recreation, right?
Recreation and leisure, yeah.
Sorry. So in that program, did you have anything on linguistics or reading development? No. Okay. But you said in your teacher education program, you were introduced to the Florida Center for Reading Research, which I think is amazing. I think you're the first teacher that I've spoken to on this podcast and webinar or webcast that had this introduced to them in their pre-service training, which is an amazing step because the vast majority of teachers don't. So you really were able to hit the ground running, knowing this and about the big 5 from the beginning. So even though when you did your AQ courses for a reading specialist, and only one of them focused on those big 5 components, other than reading comprehension, you still had that foundational knowledge, allowing you to make sure that the instruction had those components, which is amazing.
And absolutely, but I think I did have some great foundational pieces, but I was reteaching myself because we've learned stuff, all of those components, to an unconscious level. And as being dyslexic and not knowing I was dyslexic and trying to unpack all of these things by myself without the right supports wasn't as successful as maybe somebody else who didn't have a learning disability and could really comprehend all of the components. But I do feel like I had a great foundation to start with. And it gave me that motivation to seek more.
Well, I think the key thing that's really important, and especially for dyslexics, is learning about the phonological awareness and the phonemic awareness piece. Because I know, I was fortunate enough to have the support through my education with Wharton Gillingham tutoring and that sort of thing. But at that point, the focus wasn't necessarily as specific on the phonological awareness. And then I ended up taking some linguistic courses, and I'm like, oh, well, that makes sense. Why didn't you tell me that in the first place, right?
It's that explicit instruction that we need, right? So.
Exactly. And understanding things at the phoneme level. especially for the students that are struggling, right? And we know from research that readers who are at risk for reading failure typically have phonological processing deficits, right? And like hearing about the at-risk student category that you had that time teaching with, that component probably made the difference for those students.
And that's my hope, right? Is that even when I didn't know as much as I knew now, and even though I have so much more learning to do, that we still set those kids up for success and gave them the foundation, because I don't want kids to struggle the way I struggled or struggle the way my daughter struggled. And I just want everyone to be set up for success.
And that's what is a common theme among dyslexics in education, is that drive and that determination to make it better for those going forward than the experiences that they had, because they're traumatizing and difficult, and they never go away. And it's something that you think you're over, and then it comes back and you're like, well, maybe I'm not. But instead of being bitter and resentful about it in the sense that you're not going to do anything to change it, you've taken that important step in saying, no, this isn't okay. We need to do better. And I'm going to be the change that I want to see.
Yeah. And it resonates so much, because with all the research that's coming out, and with the movement for the science of reading and the Right to Read report and those recommendations, and those numbers from the I'm drawing a blank.
The Ontario Human Rights Commission, Right to Read.
Also, one of the ladders where
the ladder of reading.
Yes, the ladder of reading, and 65% of students require explicit systematic instruction. And so pairing that with our concept and our understanding and the theories behind universal design, those marry so well together.
Yeah.
It really does. So if we know better, we can do better.
And I think that's important to note, is that even though we're talking about best practices for students that are at risk for reading failure, they benefit everyone.
Yeah.
Right? They're not going to hurt anyone. It's not going to harm other students' reading development. And it gives the possibility of 95% of students reaching proficiency by the end of grade 1. And then that's still saying by the end of grade 3, which is amazing. And I think it should be the goal for every school.
Yeah. And it's doable if we have the knowledge, the content knowledge, and the resources to be able to execute that.
Yeah, of course. So can you go on from your journey?
Absolutely.
You were just talking about moving from that high-risk classroom.
And so when I moved from Section 23, I was actually heading off of a maternity leave and moving into an instructional coach position, which was a new role. And I applied just to apply, because I love to put things out in the universe. Mm-hmm. And I was provided the opportunity to become an instructional coach, and I was put in 3 schools, 2 very high needs, all high needs. And what came to light there was at that school, they started to implement a response to intervention, because they had an inverted triangle. Yeah. And I didn't have any knowledge whatsoever other than my foundational. I was like, oh, perfect. I can start to implement some of these components from the Florida Center of Reading Research, and this will be great learning. The administration team there was phenomenal, because they were very proactive, providing the release time and the support. So when I say that they took a response to intervention approach, the speech pathologist at the school was like, we should look into using dibbles. And I said, okay, great. So one of the big components to the depth of learning that happened there with educators and the administration staff and myself was the co-learning environment. So the fact that we had a speech pathologist at the table with that in-depth knowledge around phonemes, and would also take a co-teach and co-learning approach. And then we had the release time as well. So no one at the school knew, other than the speech path, knew how to utilize dibbles. So we were all learning it together. And so my lens being, if these teachers are who I need to support, then I need to really learn about how to support them with this tool using dibbles. So one of the big pieces was, as I mentioned, that co-learning, and then the release time. So learning how to analyze the data, learning how to plan. And we had cyclical cycles where we focused on the targeted instruction and really identified what the student need was. And then from there, what targeted instruction, reading instruction could we implement in order to help them make gains. And we also really unpacked what it means to do a double dip. So a tiered intervention being that we are not removing them from core instruction, that it's going to be in addition to. And because student absenteeism was also a big factor, kind of monitoring that too, to see when was the best time to implement our reading instruction. It might not be right at the bell because you have a lot of friends who are not at their best first thing in the morning or coming in late. So really being as responsive as possible to the student need and the socioeconomics in the school as well, and the dynamics, but also giving the teachers the support, the personnel support, but the resources as well, and pairing that together to really set them up for success. And the release time. The release time in school where they can really unpack the learning and feel like it's not an onus on their own time to dive into that.
Of course. Yeah, because there's a lot of learning that needs to happen if you're new to this information. And it can be intimidating. And again, it's that emotional roller coaster. And, so many people have come up with the stages of grief, going through a balanced literacy pre-service training and coming through to learning about structured literacy and the science of reading. And, it's a lot to learn. I've been on this journey for years, and I'm still learning things on a regular basis. And there's so many amazing books and resources and webinars out there that can just help you take that deeper dive and taking you to that next step. And I think it's important to realize that, you're not alone in this journey. And there is a community out there to support you. There is the Right to Read Initiative Facebook group, among many others. And knowing that there are people who are going through this and happy to go through it with you, I think makes all the difference.
Absolutely. It is so much more vocal now, and the awareness is really starting to spread. So that everyone can tap into the ability to build their own knowledge, but also that it should be built in tandem, that we're supported at the school level, and that you can take that professional knowledge, because we are held to our professional standards, and that you want to continue to develop your expertise so that you can continue to use best research to inform your best practice.
Of course. Now, what are some of those pieces or resources that you think have really made a difference for you on this journey?
So for me, I have accessed a plethora of readings, but Dibbles was foundational for me prior to moving into a consultant position. So we really unpacked Dibbles, and then we used
Sorry, one thing
yeah.
were you aware of Dibbles from your pre-service training and the importance of screening, or was that part of it? No? Okay.
No. So that was all new to me. And another piece that was very foundational for supporting my learning was having that network. So having the speech pathologists to check in and to be able to have those conversations, but also there was a teacher who I worked alongside with as an instructional coach, who was previously a reading specialist in the States and had in-depth knowledge around Dibbles. So she supported my learning so much, and I'm so thankful that I had that opportunity and that support network to be able to dive into that. And our speech and language pathologist, our communication services department, was foundational in helping me build my knowledge. So this was a great book. I've dibbled now what? It provides a lot of, it's been well loved, just about administration. And then really that next step, because our screening is only as effective as the targeted instruction.
Mm-hmm.
So for Dibbles, we really wanted to know where we were going, and that progress monitoring piece is really critical as well, to check in and see if you need to change the trajectory if those students are not going to be meeting benchmark. Then with that universal screener, we need to change either the duration, the time of day when you're doing it. So all of kind of considering all of those factors if they're not making the gains to where we want them to. So I've Dibbled Now it was a great resource. And then also Next Steps in Literacy Instruction was also connecting assessments to effective interventions. That was a really good one. So because we had Texas Primary Reading Inventory kits made up, our speech and language department did. So we had some of those resources at our fingertips for classrooms to use. This was another great one because it had a lot of phonological awareness and phoneme awareness components, and just ease of implementation, just a lot of activities, but it also went through kind of that syllable awareness and all of the components within that phonemic awareness continuum. So those were two really foundational resources for me.
And just to let listeners know, we will have links into the show notes about these resources. So don't worry if you haven't been able to write them down.
So those were two great ones to start with. And then from there, our communication services did put out what's called sound bites, and which is a collection of a board curated tool for targeting phonological awareness skills. And it's really because we have the play-based program in kindergarten, it's to infuse those aspects kind of during transitions to maximize the learning, and again, give the teachers the tools and resources to be successful.
I think it's important to know that it's very easy to include these in that play-based environment when we're talking about the phonological and the phonemic awareness. And it doesn't mean that we need to have students sitting at desks in rows doing activities. They are very engaging, playful, and the kids love them for the most part.
They do. And my program that I ran for the past 3 years we love to incorporate outdoor learning as well. So it can go with you because there's not a lot of resources that you need. Mm-hmm. And it just is a quick and easy way to do it.
Mm-hmm. Of course.
So prior to becoming a consultant, I was an instructional coach, and then I moved into a consultant role where I was afforded the opportunity to delve deeper into reading research. And one of my portfolios that I supported was all students reading by the end of grade 1. across the board. So that gave me the opportunity to then, I had a principal at the time who saw all the learning that I had immersed myself in and sent me to be formally trained in DIBELS. So that was a really great learning opportunity. And the learning continued from there. So being able to then train board staff in DIBELS as well. And then helping curate a lot of board resources. So we have the tiered approach to literacy instruction, which was put out a few years ago now, and then supporting the alphabetical principle resources and some screeners in collaboration with the speech and language communication program department. And then finally, with the prior to moving in back into the classroom for the past 3 years, facilitating the early reading strategy document that's currently a board document that is based on the 5 pillars.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
That's huge. And I just want to clarify, you're using DIBELS, not Acadians, right? Because there is a difference. They both stem from the same research, but at some point there was a split, and there you can still access DIBELS and you can access Acadians, which is based on the same principles.
Yes. So I was using DIBELS,
okay,
and utilizing a lot of board resources as well, and taking that knowledge from the DIBELS measurements to kind of help inform my assessment practices. But in January, I recertified with Acadians to become a mentor with Acadians. So now I'm going to be using that as assessment tools for universal screeners. So yes, I kind of shifted along because I wanted to continue my learning. So I did that outside of the board because that DIBELS was no longer pursued at the board level when they shifted to reading specialists. So as I moved into the classroom, there was 2 maternity leaves in there, so that I have a collection of 3 little friends at home. And moving into kindergarten, I felt like I had this spark now for really revamping my entire program. And one of the pieces there was that I was going to be implementing structured literacy, and not knowing at the time that it was the science of reading and that it was structured literacy. So moving into all of those pieces and some other really foundational planning pieces that were amazing was our speech and language department, prior to me moving back into the classroom, started to do a little bit of PD on speech to print by Louisa Moats. And then this is a free resource, which I think is amazing. I based a lot of my learning around it. Foundations for Literacy, which is actually on the IDA's website. It is a Canadian Language and Literacy Research Network. And what I loved about this was it had a milestone document in it for per grade. So for kindergarten, what you can see here, my sticky notes, all of the components of those early literacy skills. So phonological awareness, alphabetic principle and phonics, vocabulary, decoding, listening, comprehension, pencil grip and writing. So it has those look fors, or where we want them to be, right? Just to have that developmental lens of what we should be acquiring by when, so that we can make sure that we're intervening to get them to where they need to be, if they're ready, if the subsequent learning has been established too.
Well, and then it highlights where we need to focus the intervention and working on the students' skill.
Absolutely. So that is also a really useful tool because it has so much evidence, research-based evidence reading strategies and instructional strategies weave throughout it, and it's very user friendly and it's free.
Free is always good. It's amazing how expensive your Amazon cart can get after going to a webinar or conference. Oh, I need to get that book. I haven't heard of that one before. And they all have great information and their unique twist.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, we're getting to the point where some of this stuff, especially on, phonological awareness and phonics, you're hearing the same stuff over again. And there has been a lot of conversations about best practices for phonological and phonemic awareness in the classroom. And it's important to stay up to date on the intensity and duration of the intervention, or classroom instruction. But that doesn't mean that the activities change.
Mm-hmm. And one of the pieces I've been trying to be cognizant about in regards to that new research is just for dyslexic students specifically, but we need to be pairing it with those graphemes and showing them the letters, that concrete component, so that they can, seeing is believing, so that they can see where they're applying it, right? So that's something that I've been cognizant of trying to weave in whenever I'm doing planning or lessons in my classroom, is that moving that really abstract thinking to concrete. And so another great resource prior to going back into the classroom, when you're on mat leave, your brain just keeps ticking. And so I
the sleep deprived mommy moments, you're like, I can do this.
Yes.
I remember all the things I created on my various mat leaves. and did.
So I did start to write the prompting framework for myself to utilize in my classroom. And I utilize the Teaching Synthetic Phonics, which is in primary schools, which is more of a UK based resource. And they used a lot of the research from the UK because phonics instruction was so prevalent there. So that was a great resource. It's really also really well loved. I really like that one because it really gives you a lot of information around what it should look like. It's very practical. And then also lessons in teaching in phonics in primary schools. So that was another amazing resource that really helped me begin planning my program before entering back into the classroom, because I knew that I needed to revamp it based on all the learning that I had experienced.
Of course.
Level through. Yeah.
And then for all those that you are just listening to this as a podcast, as she holds up these books and is showing them to us, we can see that they're well loved and have a lot of tags. So it's not just something that she's saying, oh yeah, I bought this. I read like a page or two and yeah, it was good. Yeah. These are books that you have gone through page by page, probably several times, and make reference to and pull things out of.
Yeah.
So it's not like these are just ones that
are on the shelf.
Yeah.
One of the great additional pieces that I learned and took away from my instructional coach days and even as a consultant was just broadening our idea of assessment, right? So moving away, being able to measure the smallest growth of learning. And when we think about DRA or developmental reading assessment or PM benchmarks or any of that, oftentimes our kids are showing growth, but it's not being measured in the way that we need it to be measured in order to track that progress, to track that growth in order to measure their progress as well. So what I mean by that is that the students could be really consolidating a lot of letter sounds, but it's not going to be measured in a DRA because that's not what it's measuring. So we really need to know what it is that our assessments are looking for in order to help us program plan. and meet student need.
Well, and I think that's a very important point that you just brought up, because a lot of people will try and do some progress monitoring measures and not really be cognizant of what they're actually measuring in that assessment. So if you're doing something like an intensive phonics intervention with a student and you're not seeing much progress, you need to then look at the assessment to see what they're actually looking at. Because if they are testing on words that the student hasn't learned the letter sound correspondence, is their score is not going to go up because they still haven't learned that code. So it's important to figure out what you're doing, whether you're doing assessment of learning or assessment for learning. So when you're doing assessment of learning, you want to make sure that you're focusing on the concepts that you've covered. And it may have to be one that you create yourself because you know exactly what you want to see and what you want to measure to see if the student is making the progress. When you're doing assessment of learning, you want to say, okay, well, given what we've taught you, how's it going based on, what we would expect? And realizing that they may not see the same progress because what the assessment, if it's a standardized one or whatever, doesn't have the material that you've been working on. And you're not teaching for the test, you're teaching for the skills that the student needs to develop so they can be successful in the long run.
Absolutely. And a lot of those pieces, those early literacy pieces, we can change that, right? So we're giving ourselves that benchmark or the cut point per risk, and then we are intervening to get them to where they need to be. But oftentimes what we saw kind of emerge was that, yes, in isolation, they can tackle that skill, but now we really want to be intentional around how we've modeled and shown students how to transfer that, because we want that authentic application as well, because and pair that with our triangulation of data so that you're seeing the transfer of the skill within a text too, right? Because yes, in isolation, in a one-on-one skill development, or if you're teaching that student to identify the first sounds or go through and identify and segment the phonemes, then we want to start embedding that into text. Oftentimes I've seen that we hesitate to transfer that, but I'll have those texts right there ready so that the students see where we're applying it into the text, because sometimes they don't make that connection.
And that's where having decodable texts based on your scope and sequence and materials can be very useful, especially if you want to do something like look at oral reading fluency and you have a decodable text based on the code knowledge that you've been teaching to the student. That's more accurate than a list of words that you may find in a standardized test, because they're not considering the scope and sequence of those standardized tests. But you can complete a simple oral reading fluency task with any text.
Yeah.
Right. And if you're looking to pair it with the instruction, grab that decodable text you've been working on in the sequence there, especially if you're using a sequence that has a lot of resources available with it. There are numerous ones. So you can very easily grab a different one that your student hasn't worked on. So it'll be a novel read of the book, but it's using the code knowledge they've been taught.
Absolutely. So I know that we've been seeing a lot of decodable text being introduced, and does that align to your scope and sequence, right? So how does it complement the resources that you're putting out for students to access, especially in a kindergarten program as well, like the classroom as a third teacher, the provocations that we're putting out as well. And so how are they working in tandem? Because you want those to align to your scope and sequence.
Definitely.
Yes.
Definitely. And then asking the students to spell words that fit in that scope and sequence to see if they're translating what they've learned about phonics into print. That being said, what do you think are the most influential steps on this journey that you've taken? And what would your advice be to a teacher that's just starting on this journey?
I'd say an open door policy. So being collaborative with staff and educators who really have that like-minded, in-depth knowledge to help support each other. And that has been very foundational for me, was being able to tap into those resources, those people resources, and then having that permission for yourself to know that you need to grow, right? So and that we're reflective in our practice so that it's constantly evolving. Collaboration helps us really, it provides us for a means to be reflective, because the learning is only as useful as how we can be reflective as practitioners, so that we know the next steps for students and we know the next steps for ourselves. And the Facebook groups are great. All of those, the PD also beyond your board. So connecting with your International Dyslexic Association, connecting with speech and language pathologists, and just taking your learning into your hands, taking your learning journey into your own hands, so that you can help guide where your next learning needs to be, because we are all at different continuums of learning on this journey. So only you would really know where you need to go.
Yeah, and holding yourself to that professional accountability.
Absolutely.
Realizing that if your district or your school isn't providing you with the opportunities that you need, being able to look elsewhere.
Yeah, and that is going to help kids and set your students up for success when we are accountable for where our learning needs to go. And just like a physician, I would want my physician to have the best research available, to be utilizing that newest research. And I would expect the same and I hold myself to that same standard, as being able to stay on top of all of that new learning, because we are shaping the future minds and we want to set them up for success.
Yes, of course. And, if you're not sure where to start out and you're using screening in your classroom, look to where you have those clusters of low scores and start there.
Absolutely. Especially if the percentage of students, if you have that inverted triangle, then a lot of your core instruction can shift, right? Because if a majority of your students are needing that, then you can start implementing that in whole group, because it is challenging to be in the classroom at times and be able to meet all of your students' needs at the same time, especially if they're at different phases within that reading development. So continuum. So really making use and knowing when to implement whole group and knowing when to implement small group to maximize instructional time.
Definitely. Well, that's great. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Well, thank you.
I've really enjoyed it, and I look forward to our next conversation about, in your classroom and those tools that you use.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much, Kathryn.